hear from experts on policy, research and practice, on the practical tools that are needed to guide decision-making on nutrition policy, implementation and program design. I'm Hilary Davies Kershaw. I'm an assistant professor at LSHTM and part of the nutrition work stream for the Stunting Hub. And I'd like to welcome our speakers today, Rose Nadolo from World Vision, Saskia Depere from WFP, and Tom Davis from World Vision. Right, so if we can start with Rose. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. So thank you, Hilary. I'll be presenting on behalf of the Stunting Hub, and my presentation is really to set the scene for this webinar. So I'll be talking briefly about global nutrition policy and an example of interdisciplinary research, how that can help us to move from policy to impact. And I also work as a senior nutrition advisor with World Vision, but I'm here with the Stunting Hub as a policy fellow for today. So to start off with, global policy enablers, it's things that you know, but just as a reminder, we all know that nutrition is a smart investment. So for every dollar invested, you have an annual potential of annually, you have potential to yield up to 81% US dollars for national economies. And we also know that reducing malnutrition in Africa and Asia specifically, you can increase productivity by 11%. And the other thing we have in common is we have agreed global child nutrition goals and priorities, in the form of World Health Assembly targets and SDGs, SDG 2 in particular. And we have a common narrative really in the discourse, I would say, since the 2008 and 2013 Lancet series on maternal child nutrition, which gave us the framework for multi-sector action for nutrition. So framing around nutrition specific and nutrition sensitive action for nutrition. So that's a common narrative we've all been working with, and it's a good lever for us. In terms of mechanisms, I'll just highlight three things. So we have the Global Nutrition Report that's every year, and that provides accountability for the global targets. We also have financial and policy commitments, and they're not adequate, but it's a starting point. So for instance, the Nutrition for Growth, which was last year, and pledged $27 billion US for nutrition until 2030. So that's a starting point. It's not more is needed, but that's a good place to start. And of course, I think the most important thing really moving from the global to national and local is that in countries, high burden countries, you have national and subnational nutrition plans, and these tend to be multi-sectoral. So that's really translating that global policy into multi-sector action for nutrition, and that's useful. But then turning on to blockers, and there are many, I'm just going to highlight a few, there are many challenges to nutrition, but one of the things is that nutrition targets are off track. So especially anemia and wasting. Stunting has been reducing the last 20 years, but that's going to be impacted already because of COVID. There are projections of the very high impacts of projected impacts of that. We know with climate change, unless we do something, that's going to impact the nutrition targets. And at the moment, we have the food and hunger crisis, which is going to impact these targets even more. And, in terms of children affected, really over a fifth of children are stunted, and children under 5 years. But then the challenge is even bigger in that malnutrition is so unequal. You have disparities of malnutrition, how it's distributed across regions, but even within countries, you find different pockets of malnutrition, presenting in different ways. And that's really useful. And I think we'll come to that in terms of the role of research, because I think that's really a challenge we continue to face and not really come to grips on how to manage this at scale, really. And then gendered factors, really a lot of limited progress on women's diets. And of course, that affects children's health and children's diet, women's time and burden on their caregiving responsibilities and their participation in livelihoods, in markets, etc. And of course, their own diet. And then on implementation gaps, we have policies and strategies, as I said, the national nutrition plans, but then there's a gap in prioritizing interventions. So when you look at policies and strategies, there's a lot of interventions by different actors, but how to prioritize those interventions to have the maximum impact and to the places where they're most needed. I think that's a challenge. We tend to have blanket interventions in an area, in a region, in a country, and routine services are important. But I think when we have deep challenges, then we need to prioritize and target interventions better. And then the complexity of individualized planning, while we look at multi-sector action for nutrition as it's really brings us all together, there's also a challenge that planning still remains, very siloed in sectors and ministries of health, agriculture, social protection. Everyone still goes away and plans on their own for their annual plans, etc. So how do we bring these things together? And then there's inadequate feedback mechanisms to inform policy and programmatic decisions. And I know Tom will talk about how to even involve community in that. So I will not go very much further on that. And the final one, which is really quite obvious, is inadequate funding. While we have commitments quite very recent, at the same time, there's a shortfall that's being estimated at the level of $11 billion at the moment. And of course, that's going to be impacted even further by COVID-19, climate change, the food and hunger crisis, conflict, etc. So just to turn a bit to interdisciplinary research and give you an example of what the Stunting Hub is doing in what they're calling the whole child approach, really to help us or to play their part in moving the global policy for child nutrition into impact. So what's the whole child approach? It's really shifting the focus from single parts of malnutrition to the whole child and looking at the child as a whole. So looking at the whole child environment and as an individual, but in the environment where they live and they thrive. And so the Stunting Hub research, which is interdisciplinary, is looking to understand the drivers of child stunting. So that's useful, not just stunting as an outcome, but what's driving stunting. But again, the synergies and interrelationships between those drivers. And I think this is important because this starts to help us understand the complex issue of stunting and child malnutrition, really, how the different drivers interact with each other. But also, I think importantly is this work on understanding the critical points at which growth starts to falter for a child. So they're looking at very deep biology, gut health and nutrition and epigenetics and microbiome and how those interact with the home environment, behaviors, diet, parasites, and the educational environment, which I think this is quite innovative in the nutrition space, looking at early childhood development, especially, and the work they're doing on how you can ameliorate the effects and reverse really the effects of stunting for children who are already affected. I think that's really transformational, so that those children are not, while we are preventing stunting, the children that are already stunted are not then condemned for life, because we know their potential is reduced, but we want to be able to address that as well. And then they're also looking at food systems, so the bigger issues of markets and value chains, access and affordability of food, and looking at food safety. And I talked about early childhood development and cognition. So in terms of just some of the interventions, really is, I'll give an example. So one of the interventions is on egg intervention for pregnant women, which is looking at the impact of eggs on the epigenetic and the microbiome signatures of pregnant women, and of course the birth weight. And that's really trying to bring interventions that break the intergenerational cycle of malnutrition. So that's just one example of how the different parts are trying to work together. And this study is being implemented in India, in Indonesia, and Senegal. So as I wrap up quite quickly, just to summarize then, how can research help us to move from policy and to impact? I think one of the things is research can help us to have a holistic approach in how we understand and address the multifactorial nature of malnutrition. So really breaking silos of how we understand malnutrition. those drivers of malnutrition, understanding that at depth, and then we can bring in interventions to address those underlying causes of malnutrition, but also helping us with a comprehensive framing of malnutrition. So we've talked about, the multi-sector action for nutrition. That's being informed by research in the past, but also we still have work to do around moving from single parts and how we framed things, for instance, treatment versus prevention of malnutrition, or stunting versus wasting, or humanitarian versus development, which are all important and needed, but I think being able to move away from looking at those as exclusive of one another. We know now that a child can be wasted and stunted at different times in their lives. And we know humanitarian and development is not that exclusive. We have areas that are in chronic fragility, they suffer emergencies. We have development or stable areas that have recurring emergencies, due to climate effects like flooding, drought, etc. And then the other thing is on modeling of impact. And I think this can be quite exciting, how research can help us as programmers, and I talk as a programmer here, to be able to package interventions in a way that we maximize impact. So improving that effectiveness. So if you have disparities of malnutrition in a country like, let's say, Kenya, how do you apply packages of interventions in different places? And I know there are tools that have been used, like the Optima tool and many others that other speakers might talk about, to really maximize that impact, but also the cost effectiveness with the resources that are so limited, ever limited, really. How do we apply interventions in a way that is cost effective? And the final two things is that research can help us with evidence-based decision tools that for programmers to be able to use and to apply as they translate policy into programs and designs. And that's really, I think this is much more needed now at national and subnational level, when policy implementation and design of programs is taking place. And the final thing, I think this is quite obvious, but really important, is how to transfer skills from researchers to practitioners. So the collaborative research and researchers working with programmers and learning together. And just the final thing to say, just on the decision tools, I just mentioned that the Stunting Hub, I know they're working on a decision tool that at the end of the research will be available publicly. So that can be used by program designers and policy implementers. And I think that's quite the kind of thing we are looking at really as people in policy and programming. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much. And I'll be happy to take questions during the Q&A at the end. Back to you, Hilary. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rose, for that very clear presentation and for all the sobering facts, especially about the blockers from global policy to impact, but also the innovative research that the Hub are doing with the cohort studies and the interventions in countries where childhood stunting is very prevalent still, but also using the whole child approach. So thank you very much for that. So Saskia Depé, we hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hilary, and a pleasure to be here and to share with you thinking on how to take policies and global guidance down to national level, or how to incorporate it in the specific context. So let me see if I can share my slides. Just to introduce myself, I'm Saskia Depé. I lead the analytics and science for food and nutrition team at the World Food Programme. I've been at the World Food Programme for 15 years and in this field for 25. I'm a scientist who's very close to programming and implementation. So I'll center the presentation around stunting, and I like to unpack what underlies stunting, and then how we can take evidence-based approaches to multi-sectoral implementation in countries. So we know different factors are associated with stunting. If we look across countries, a higher GDP has, in countries there's less stunting. Within countries, a higher wealth quintiles have lower stunting. Rural areas tend to have higher stunting than urban areas. Parental education is associated, which reflects income earning potential as well as aptitude to work with new knowledge and insights. And then the minimum adequate diet, as well as the affordability of a healthy, nutritious diet, they are strongly correlated with stunting as well. So those two factors, as well as the others, clearly indicate that there's a strong dietary quality component that underlies stunting. It's also what we saw in Rose's picture with the circle, the inner circle, the wider circles. So I want to do a deeper dive on the affordability of a healthy and nutritious diet. So to the right, showing here the lowest possible cost of a nutritious diet and the expenditure curve, so the amount of money spent on food. So those households that spend less than the lowest possible cost, they cannot afford a nutritious diet. So that's in this case 33% of the households. Their food expenditure is lower than the lowest possible cost of a nutritious diet. And we estimate this cost using the software from Save the Children, the cost of the diet software. And we base it on local food prices as well as local expenditure curves. And then you can also see that the extent to which the households that cannot afford that lowest possible cost, that extent differs to where they are on the expenditure curve. And we'll get back to that as well. So here, just an example from Indonesia. So here we are showing the proportion of households whose food expenditure is below that lowest possible cost. And that ranges throughout the country between 4 and 53%. And that ability to afford a nutritious diet, that correlates with the dietary diversity of the child diet. So this is also for Indonesia. So on the x-axis, you see the proportion of households that are unable to afford a nutritious diet. And then the higher that proportion, the lower the dietary diversity. So it's clear, just want to show this, to show you that that indicator of affordability, that does correlate with dietary diversity, and they both correlate with stunting prevalence. So when we're faced with a high stunting prevalence and what we call then the affordability gap, we need interventions across sectors. And let's look at the figure in the middle. The larger the gap between the cost and what people can afford, the lower the quality of the diet. And that, of course, underlies then stunting, wasting, micronutrient deficiencies, and also overweight and obesity. And then, you know, you're at a higher level, but still below being able to afford. Or you can just afford, but your choices are not optimal. That's then kind of in this space here. So from the health sector, you know, we'll say, well, we have proven interventions to prevent stunting. Now we're talking to people in social protection, they'll say, well, we have delivery platforms and we have modalities. So we may be providing cash, or we may be providing basic commodities to households, such as with the PSNP program in Ethiopia, or in India with the large food-based safety nets. So can we contribute to reducing stunting by leveraging those platforms and modalities maybe? From the food system side, and I'm speaking explicitly agriculture and private sector partners, they say, well, what can we do to improve dietary diversity, which we understand is related, and access to healthy diets? So you can already see that we can come at this question with different starting points and different contributions that we could possibly make. So let's then look at that evidence from the health sector, because that's really where we have the proven interventions. So from the health sector, infant and young child feeding promotion has been shown for good reasons to be able to reduce child malnutrition, select better options and more feeding frequency, hand washing, and so forth. And we also know that in food insecure contexts, just that promotion is not sufficient. Because we can understand now from the affordability gap, if you have such a big affordability gap, there's only so much you can do and you can choose and you can improve. So for food insecure context, the recommendation is to also have and that's now called the public provision of complementary foods. It's not very specific in the sense what complementary foods should these be, but we can understand that they must be of good nutritional value. So from the social protection side, the question is, well, very often these programs provide cash. So is it sufficient to add infant and young child feeding promotion to that cash provision is then a question. And there is some evidence that when you provide cash, stunting can come down. But the critical question here is how much cash and to what extent does stunting reduce? From the food system side, the question is more around the complementary foods. So what should that composition of a good complementary food be? And should this be eggs, for example, like the example that Rose just mentioned of the research that's going on with eggs for pregnant and lactating women? Should it be pumpkins, leafy vegetables, or how about a processed or a fortified food? So these complementary foods that are mentioned by the health sector, and of course we also have research on very specific complementary foods. What exactly are they? So we have to become quite specific in the context, and we have to see how it can integrate with the programming and the strategies of other sectors. So this is where the affordability gap, conducting that work at a country level, subnationally, can really help us. And that's what the team that I lead at the World Food Programme, we run these analyses. We've done that in 40 countries by now. So what I'm showing you is also really building on that experience. So we say, well, we need the different sectors, and they can make complementary contributions to reducing the affordability gap and improving nutrition. So the different levers that we can work with, and let's start at the top here, at the left, that expenditure needs to increase. Then we can afford more and we'll have more choices. And that can be with cash transfers from a social protection program. It can be with agricultural support and resilience. It can be with other livelihood activities. Then we have, for specific individuals, we have targeted interventions. So that's where our complementary foods come in, but also school meals, also interventions for pregnant and lactating women, micronutrient supplementation, and so forth. And then to the bottom right, there's also real value in increasing the availability and lowering the prices of nutritious foods so that it becomes more affordable to choose nutritious foods. And we can, of course, also make foods more nutritious by improving the nutrient content. And that's where fortification comes in, both biofortification as well as post-harvest fortification. So then we want to understand the contributions more quantitatively of these different interventions. So let me show you here an example from Pakistan. So in Pakistan, you can see the affordability, the cost of a nutritious diet in dark blue, and the expenditure curve. And you'll see that 65 to 75% of the population could not afford that lowest possible cost. What you can also see in the red is the transfer value from the social protection program. And that transfer is provided to the poorest 20% of households. So that transfer size is not very big. So it was not possible to close this gap here completely. And that then means that because of that continued and quite substantial affordability gap, nutrition cannot improve very much with just that intervention. So in Pakistan, they've, based on this realization, gone ahead to add a specific component to the social protection program that fills the nutrient gap during the first 1,000 days. So for pregnant and lactating women and for children under 2. And it's linked to that social protection program. So those in those bottom 20%, the pregnant and lactating women and children under 2 in that group, they receive a specialized nutritious foods, and they are getting a cash transfer when they come to the health center for the regular services plus that special food that they get there as well. Now showing it's very similar, just showing it in a different way. And for Nigeria, different areas of Nigeria, the poorest 10% of households, they spend these dark parts on food, and their total cost of a nutritious diet is substantially higher. So they have quite a gap remaining. And the blue amount, that is the cash transfer size. So you can see that that cash transfer size is low compared to what they need. So nutritional deficiencies will still be very prevalent with that intervention being in place. Now, adding a nutritious food for pregnant and lactating women, which is also going to be shared in the household, that has the potential to further reduce that affordability gap because it provides good specific nutritional value. And here another example from Ethiopia, where a voucher was given for fresh foods. And it just shows that choice also matters. So here the fresh food voucher is spent on onions and potatoes, whereas here it's spent on kale and milk. So then it makes a much larger contribution, whereas the value is the same. So the monetary value is the same, but by making better choices, it makes a better contribution to meeting the nutritional needs. So this is how we engage social protection sector to discuss how to make social protection more nutrition sensitive, realizing the gap, realizing how far the cash contribution can go, and how we can add specific interventions to make it go further. So in conclusion, it's really important to position complementary food supplements to prevent malnutrition as a food-based intervention so that we can engage social protection, we can engage food system actors, and center it around that affordability gap, which also helps us quantify and compare. And those complementary food supplements, they must of course be selected based on nutritional value. And they should be provided to those subgroups of households and families with children who need it most. Not, some areas, yes, we need a blanket, but in some areas we don't need it blanket. We need it to the most vulnerable households. So we must identify the channels and the distribution platforms that can reach them. So you saw for social protection, and then the goal is, of course, longer term, and human capital development is really the goal that speaks to social protection colleagues. And then it can also be as a shock response, which can be social protection. It can also be humanitarian response. And then the emphasis is often more on preventing acute impacts and hence on wasting, as well as micronutrient deficiencies. And then really important to monitor, to assess actual coverage and actual utilization, because that's of course what's required to have that impact. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Saskia. Really interesting to hear about the affordability gap, but also that promotion may not be enough, that the three sectors really need to work together to help, especially with the people where the gap is really, really large. So thank you very much for that, and for the illustration of Pakistan as well. So can we move on to Tom Davis from World Vision?
So good morning and afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this presentation on how research can inform implementation. I'll be focusing on the use of formative research and also on asking the right research questions. So I'm a huge believer in formative research at the beginning of programs as a way to improve outcomes and increase impact, since the best programs with which I've been involved started with a lot of rapid formative research and then continued to use it throughout the program to be able to tweak the implementation of it. Formative research, of course, is conducted to help the development of a program, to be able to decide on the target audience, to describe the target audience, to understand the factors which influence their behavior, and we'll talk about a specific example of that, and determine the best ways to reach them. So this is some of the research that we need to be doing to contextualize it and not just assume that stunting can be addressed everywhere the same way, is caused by the same things everywhere, and the same for underweight. Some examples, of course, of formative research are like positive deviance studies, trials of improved practices, barrier analysis, possibly human-centered design can be put in that as well, and retrospective mortality studies, ethnography, and of course focus groups. But I'm going to be talking about some of the ones I found really did the most good. So this is a publication on a project that I helped design a few years back, where we used 3 different forms of formative research: a positive deviance inquiry at the beginning, a retrospective mortality study, and a barrier analysis, 4 different barrier analysis studies. And I'll talk about 2 of those. This is an important project to learn from, since the final evaluator of that project and one of the co-authors of the study remarked, as far as we know, this is among the most cost-effective child survival projects ever implemented at scale. We reached a population of 1.1 million people and achieved an overall 38% reduction in underweight in less than 5 years. We saw excellent results in terms of adoption of health, nutrition, and wash behaviors, and an estimated 36% decline in under 5 mortality. And we did that at a cost of less than $3 per beneficiary per year, and that included everything: all project costs, backstopping costs, indirect costs, everything. And so that yielded a cost per life saved of only $441. That's 5 times less than the average child survival project. And I think the formative research had something to do with the effectiveness. So how did formative research inform the project design for this? Well, first we conducted a rapid and rigorous positive deviance study. I've got a picture of the cover of that, which we called a local determinants of malnutrition study. And in that study, we interviewed 45 caregivers of children 12 to 59 months of age with a good weight for age, and excluded those with higher income and some other things, and compared them to about 45 caregivers of children 12 to 59 months who were underweight. We then looked for statistically significant differences among those 2 groups in terms of the food they consumed, the feeding practices of the children, child care practices, and care-seeking practices. We also explored some things like maternal depression, alcoholism in the family, corporal punishment. We threw the net pretty wide on that. We found a lot of useful information from these PDIs in 4 countries. Specifically in Mozambique, we found among the 12 important findings, 45% of the well-nourished positive deviant children said their caregivers said that they usually or always completely emptied their breast when breastfeeding the child, when only 10% of the mothers of malnourished children did so. And if we do have any non-nutritionists in the crowd, basically that's very important, because that first milk to come out of the breast, the forward milk, usually is very high in water, less so in fat, great for hydration, but it's that hind milk, the last milk to come out, that is richest in terms of fat and thus calories. So this was a very important thing. That finding led us to put a lot more attention on this important behavior and develop key messages around it. And by final, 99% of all the moms were doing this. PDIs can be very useful for identifying those overlooked but important behaviors that are associated with a good outcome, like a healthy weight for age. And World Vision did a World Health Assembly side event here in Geneva just recently that was talking about treatment of acute malnutrition. And the WHO representative working on the acute malnutrition treatment guidance said that these sort of positive deviance studies on wasting would be very useful to the WHO. So I think we should get cracking on that. And after the PDI, we conducted 4 barrier analysis studies, one of which was on exclusive breastfeeding, since we found that only 17% of the children were exclusively breastfed at baseline. Through those studies, we found why some moms exclusively breastfeed and others don't. For example, mothers who exclusively breastfeed were 4.5 times more likely to say it was a lower cost that was really an advantage to them of doing it, and that their family and friends approved of the practice. So we used a method to reach more influencers knowing this and messaged around the low cost. But rather than going more into depth on this and boring any ag folks we have, let's talk about an agricultural practice where we use barrier analysis as well. So first of all, barrier analysis is a major tool that we promote in World Vision and that is promoted in the USAID's guidance on integrating social behavior change into climate change adaptation. It's a rapid assessment formative research tool to identify the behavioral determinants associated with a particular behavior. These studies are done to develop more effective behavior change messages and activities. And a key feature is that you compare doers, the people actually doing a behavior, to those who are not doing the behavior, the non-doers. The comparison allows you to look for correlations between responses and the behaviors so you can better identify what might be adopting that behavioral adoption of these key health and nutrition behaviors. Barrier analysis has now been used in more than 40% of lower and middle income countries. Analysis done with a simple Excel spreadsheet, and it's been used extensively for nutrition, but also for health, agriculture, WASH, and a lot of other things. The determinants in the box there at the bottom are the usual determinants, but you can add some things to it. It includes things like perceived social norms, whether you think that people important to you want to see you doing the behavior, that agree with the behavior, and also things like perceived severity, whether you think that the particular problem, like stunting, is serious or not, but it's flexible in terms of what you look at with this. There are a lot of barrier analysis studies in the published literature. There have been over 150 other barrier analysis studies, mostly done in lower and middle income countries, on a lot of other behaviors, some of which appear in the published literature. So I won't go through all of these steps, but I think you have the general idea. You're talking to 45 doers, comparing them to 45 non-doers of something like exclusive breastfeeding or an ag practice, and then comparing them to find out what might be the difference. So let's look at an agricultural example this is from Guatemala, where an INGO was promoting a natural resource management practice as helpful in mitigating the impact of drought. That is, of course, has a huge impact on nutrition. In the Catholic Relief Services Segamaya program, they're working in 2 different departments there, San Marcos and Baja Verapaz. The 2 areas are quite similar culturally and otherwise. And in June of 2009, the staff in San Marcos were trained on barrier analysis and used it. And what they wanted to look at was planting live barriers along the edges of planting terraces. These are live barriers, are strips of vegetation planted along that contour that anchor the soil in place with the roots and has some other benefits. This helps in mitigating, of course, some of the problems with climate change. CRS had been actually promoting this behavior for many years, yet very few people had adopted the practice, despite the fact that it only required labor and local free plant material. So they wanted to find out what's going on here. They also did they had planned to do a barrier analysis study in San Marcos, but then they got too busy to do that. So that area served as a comparison area to look at, well, what sort of value add do you get with barrier analysis? And in that other area, they just use their kind of business as usual process for deciding how to promote it, focus groups, staff discussions, things like that. So what they found there through this barrier analysis study in San Marcos was that most farmers already fully understood the advantages of the practice, but the doers of the behavior worked together in groups to actually do the behavior. And the doers said they liked the practice because they did not lose plantings due to drought. People who tried it out but then lost plants due to drought abandoned it and didn't want to attempt it again. So given those findings, staff focused there on organizing farmers to work together on each other's lands during the off-season to plant the live barriers, also having farmers brainstorm on ways to prevent loss of plants due to drought, and then train them how to diminish that potential negative consequence of the behavior. So what did they see by doing this study and responding to the results using barrier analysis versus what was done in the comparison areas? Well, in terms of adoption of the behavior measured in terms of hectares planted with live barriers, adoption in San Marcos, where they used the tool, the blue line, increased 4-fold in 1 year. Adoption in Baja Verapaz, where they did not apply it and used a business as usual promotion of the behavior, the red line, it decreased by 25% in the same year. Focus groups with staff also found that it really changed how they thought about behavior change, their role in it, and the sort of usefulness of this sort of formative research data. So these are two types of formative research: positive deviance inquiries and barrier analysis that can really add value for projects and can help support project designers and decision makers. And let's talk now about some research questions that I think are important. One question that we're most interested in right now, and I think more people should be given this huge hunger crisis that we have in front of us, is what program models and approaches can reliably prevent wasting, the most deadly form of malnutrition, at the lowest cost? And one way to do that would be to replicate this study that's shown below. It was a CRT done in Burundi, one of the poorest countries in the world, which found that the care group behavior change approach, coupled with food rations and a small dose of health system strengthening, reduced wasting by 50% compared to controls, with the greatest impact being on the most vulnerable children. This Tubara-Murray study was a CRCT. It was done by IFRI, which IFRI is an ANH Academy partner, actually. This same project also reduced stunting anemia, increased household food security and diets, and improved motor and language development in children. So just a lot of results across the board in a very integrated way. I think we should be looking very carefully at multi-sectoral models like this, which are producing results not only for nutrition and health and ag, but across the sectors. With World Vision's multi-sectoral version of the care group approach, which we call nurturing care groups, we also found large improvements in clean water and reduced harsh discipline of children. This can be very attractive to governments as well, since they can accomplish a lot in terms of nutrition, health, and agriculture, but also other sectors with this type of behavior change model. And they can actually change out the content depending on the sort of funding they have and sort of the local epidemiological situation that they're in. Also in Africa, according to Global Nutrition Report, the average prevalence of wasting and stunting is 6 and 31%. That means that 94% and 69% of children are not wasted and not stunted. It's not that you go to one community and find 2% wasting and another nearby with 15% wasting. The really greatest difference is between households and between cultural groups. And that means it may be in part due to behaviors, but also exposure. So that gap in terms of what they're able to purchase, that is very important. They did have food rations as part of the study I showed below, but we're also seeing that sometimes the difference is actually what caregivers are doing with their child. So we need more high quality PD inquiries focused on wasting and stunting, and also barrier analysis to better understand why people adopt certain health, nutrition, and ag behaviors that are important and others don't. We need to make it easy as possible for people to adopt behaviors and practices that improve their and their child's nutrition. The in a given context of this is super important. I think we need to supplement global research and meta-analysis with national level contextual research, which means that many of you watching this need to start publishing. And publishing results of formative research is a good way to get started in this. Lastly, I think we also need to be asking how we can better engage communities, community workers, and family members in addressing agriculture, nutrition, and health challenges. For example, World Vision conducted research on family MUAC, where you teach caregivers how to actually measure their child's arm to know if they might be acutely malnourished. What we found was doing that led to the children who were referred because the caregiver had been trained in this were 11 times less likely to be hospitalized when they went in for treatment. than when just a community health worker was stopping by and found out that they had malnutrition. Caregivers are able to do this screening at 1/3 of the cost, only $1 per child as compared to screening by community health workers. And we need to do treatment of uncomplicated wasting at the community level through simplified protocols for community health workers. The WHO says they don't have enough information on that. We need to provide them that information so that they can be scaled up. And lastly, we need to be exploring why some children have both stunting and wasting. And we'll need to have specific strategic approaches possibly to address that combination and more surveillance than we do presently. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Tom. Thank you for explaining the importance of formative research, especially barrier analysis, to help improve outcomes of programs, and also the use of positive deviance in the community to help communicate those messages. So thank you so much to all three of our speakers. They were really excellent and thought-provoking presentations. So if we can take some questions from the audience, and we've also got a few questions on the chat box. If you could just put your hand up.
So Sasika, I just wanted to quickly, so you mentioned in one of your slides that a lot of households, they're sharing food, that whole concept. And so I just wanted to ask, how do these programs, how does WFP, how do they ensure that the most vulnerable people within those households are receiving the nutritious meals?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sarah. We very often provide specific nutritious foods for specific household members, but we also know food entering the household will get shared. So especially foods that need preparation, such as what we call super cereal. It needs to be cooked. We don't cook very small portions because we have a certain pot size, we need the cooking fuel, and so forth. So the type of food will also make it more or less likely for it to be shared. Of course, we give clear messages to say this is for this individual because of this reason. So it's important that this does really get consumed by that individual. The foods that are ready to eat, it's a bit easier for those because they don't need preparation. They can be consumed at a moment that's convenient for the recipient and the indicator individual. The packaging can say something specific. But in general, there also needs to be more understanding of the need for specific foods by specific individuals. With our analyses, when we show that the cost of an adolescent girl is actually really high, it is high because her needs are high. So we will say, if you have a fish and you're distributing the fish, give a larger share to those individuals that have higher nutritional needs, such as adolescent girls or such as young children. So there's also a lot of awareness raising that needs to be done.
Thanks, Saskia. There's a question from Julia. I'm just going to read it out and just ask if you've answered in the chat box, but if you could elaborate. So what do you think are the mechanisms to lower the cost of nutritious foods? And is this through trade and agriculture policy, or is it more effective for nutrition outcomes to focus on increasing incomes and social safety nets?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So the new SOFI report will be launched next week, but we already know from the last year's and the previous year's report that 3 billion people cannot afford the lowest cost healthy diet. So the people who cannot afford are really many, and that affordability gap, of course, varies, but we need both interventions that will lower the cost, and we need interventions that will increase incomes. And many people are, for their income, dependent on agriculture. So we also want the price of food to come down, but their incomes to be increased. So that means that there is a lot of change required across the food production system. There's been a large emphasis on producing enough foods or enough food, but of relatively few crops. So the agricultural support has been done in a way that ensured that we don't have famines, but it has not been done in a way that increases our access to diverse foods and to a lower cost of a greater diversity of foods. So there is definitely a need for change in the way that foods are produced, for the productivity of a variety of crops, as well as for incomes to then increase. And that also relates to where can you go with your produce? Are there roads to take it to market? Is there a way to prevent loss? Can you ensure against pests as well as climate issues? So the whole agricultural production side of things needs a lot of change. And also you saw from the examples of the social protection that cash transfer is relatively small. So that is not going to close that gap to a large extent. So we also need to bring it down from the food price and diet cost side of things.
Thanks so much, Saskia. I wondered if the group from, Tapasvi, you were mentioning about food supplement to pregnant mothers and the scheme in India. I wondered if you could explain that?
No, it's just regarding the food supplement. The food supplement, Julia, I think, spoke about the supplement to complementary food and children. But it equally, I think, pregnant and lactating mothers supplement in the public distribution system, or we can say that even we have started in India some places like some of the state, they have started to provide one full meal for entire 9-month duration to pregnant mothers. So that ensure the enough nutrition to mothers and in turn the next generation. So that's a only, I think, comment is regarding also supplement or food supply to pregnant mothers, and we can ensure that also. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tabazi. And then we've got a question from Joseph Aringa to Saskia. What would you consider to be the most critical factor impeding dietary diversity among the most vulnerable outside of household income? And how can the barriers to tailoring interventions to local context be surmounted given the inequalities in publishing highlighted on Tuesday?
I'm not familiar with what, I didn't follow what was published on Tuesday, but besides income, it is really the food environment. So what do people have access to there? Can they get to markets, and what is in those markets? And there, it's about seasonality. It is about also sort of purchasing power. If many people don't have much to spend, then also their demand will be relatively constrained, and therefore the supply doesn't get stimulated. So yeah, it's also really on that. Yeah, and I think the points that Tom made on the qualitative research and really understanding. I mean, what we really look at, what is constraints, choices, but within what you can choose, you may also not be making the best choices. So how does that work, and why do people make certain choices, and how to influence that? I think that is important across the sort of the full spectrum. We want to see how far can it go if you made optimal choices, and therefore how can we increase the choice options, and in doing so, you can make more or less of the choices that you have. So I also want to stress that I see us really complementing.
Tom, do you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I think that's part of it. We know we have this underlying problem of not enough food, not enough food choices at times. But the question about what we can do right now, that's where I think we can do more to leverage positive deviance in particular, and just realize there are stunted and wasted and underweight children who basically, they're not the lowest income, right? And that we find, and there are a lot of children who have low income parents, that aren't stunted or wasted. So what is going on there? And the answer to that won't be a single response. It can be quite tailored. We found some things that we weren't talking about as much, like before the big Burundi project that I mentioned, where IFRI, for example, we focus more on pregnant women because we found that having pregnant women consume specific nutrients seemed to be the difference. They also found this strange finding that caregivers who salted their child's food, where it was like 7 times more likely if you salted your child's food that you'd have a well-nourished child by weight for age than not. Dr. Michael Golden, if many of you remember his research, actually brought this up, saying there might be other minerals at play that we're not just even thinking about, including sodium. Or it could just be that these slightly anorexic kids that are malnourished don't like eating very much unsalted corn gruel. So just adding a bit of salt improves palatability. But what it is locally will depend, and I think that's where we can really dig in more with PD studies.
Great, thank you so much, Tom. So we will need to wrap up there because of time. Can we just have final thoughts from our speakers? Rose?
Yeah, thanks, Hilary, for sharing this. I think really my final thoughts is how I think we have practical tools, as we've seen, through the examples that Tom has provided, and of course the examples that Saskia provided on how to move policy from global to national. And for me, because I was talking more from the global perspective, I think we really need to get we need to really move to those practical solutions and tools that we can use, that research can provide programmers, and to look at research not just as a one-off activity that's done by a particular group of people, but actually bringing research close to programming, such that and using approaches that help programmers to interact with evidence themselves. So I think it's really more working in a collaborative approach. Yeah.
Thank you, Rose. And Saskia, any final words from you?
Yeah, just to say it's really about tailoring the evidence to the context and unpacking what it is in the evidence that speaks to the local context. And we don't need too many studies to prove kind of the same thing just in a different place. We really need to see a package of things that is adapted to what is locally feasible and informed, but not dictated by the global evidence, how far that goes and how that can then be further adjusted. So a good sense of how to look and interpret and translate evidence.
Thank you, Saskia. And Tom, final words from you.
Yeah, just quickly, let's think about both. Closing the affordability gap and doing formative research to better understand current coping practices that do allow some low-income children to grow quite well. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So it's evident that we've done a huge amount, but we still need to do a lot more. And it's absolutely clear that we need to work together, that no sector can be working on its own to help with these. But also I think the importance of the formative research and using the positive deviance, as you said, Tom, is hugely important, so that we're not having a blanket approach, but actually having a more tailored approach. So thank you so much for me. I'm going to hand over to Julia.
Thank you so much to our fantastic facilitators, our chair, and all of the participants for your questions and involvement. Thank you again so much for joining, and have a good rest of your day.